The Queen's Jewish Link presents the Jewish Living Podcast, the show that examines the many facets of Orthodox Jewish life. Here's your host, Izzo Zwirin.
This week's topic is by far the most listener-requested issue. Whenever I solicit requests for topics, invariably people will ask, when are you going to cover tuition? Why don't you do a tuition episode? Hey Izzo, I think tuition is something people really want to know more about. Well, wait no longer, because here it comes.
Hi, I'm Dan Perla, Senior Director of Catalyzing Resources at Prisma, the Center for Jewish Day Schools.
Dan and I will discuss a multitude of issues about tuition in Yeshiva day schools, and he will explain to me why some conventional wisdom ideas might not yield the cost-saving results they're shooting for. All right, Dan, thank you so much for joining us this week. Welcome to the Jewish Living Podcast. If you could do a little bit of favor for everybody here. So first of all, tell us a little bit more about Prisma and exactly what it is you do, because that was a very complex title that you had in the intro there.
It is definitely a complex title. My former title was actually Director of Financial Vitality, which I used to joke financial vitality is a lot better than financial demise.
Yeah.
So we try to put So catalyzing resources or financial vitality is an area within Prisma that's dedicated to the financial health of Jewish day schools.
Oh, okay.
And Prisma is one of a small handful of umbrella organizations or central organizations that works with day schools of many stripes and colors throughout North America, which is primarily the US and Canada, on a variety of different topics related to leadership and financial sustainability and several other areas.
All right, so Prisma is this large educational organization. How did you get there?
So I worked for the Avichai Foundation from 2011 through the end of 2014. I was the program officer in charge of day school finance at the Avichai Foundation. That was a position that they created toward the latter part of their existence. And a lot of the work I do now with Prisma is work I was doing for the Avichai Foundation. And I joke that the only difference between the work I was doing there and here is that there we had the money and we're giving it out, and here we need the money and need to find it.
So Dan, you've had a lot of experience with the tuition pitfalls, I guess we're going to call it, of the Yeshiva day school education system. But I want to frame this in a very specific way. So first of all, what I want to talk about are Yeshiva's expenses. What are Yeshiva's costs, especially as it compares to public school? Because we all know that public schools, generally, you send a child to for free in North America. I don't know about other countries. But obviously, the vast majority of people listening to this who have children in Yeshiva day schools, even in yeshivas that you might not advise, they're paying some sort of a tuition. Where's that money going? Great
question. So roughly 80% of any day school or yeshiva's budget is salaries.
Right.
Now, there are many salaries, as any parent or employee in a day school can tell you, many salaries. There's administrative salaries, there's teacher salaries, there's salaries of support staff and non-educational staff as well. But the bottom line is that approximately 80% is salaries. The rest is everything else, frankly, real estate costs, office supplies, electricity and utilities, etc. But the overwhelming majority of costs in both private schools and public schools is salaries.
Okay, so when it comes to these costs that yeshivas are spending, what are we expecting yeshivas to spend in comparison to public school, let's say per child?
So the comparisons are actually pretty favorable. So if you look at New York City, for instance, last time I looked, the cost to educate a child in the New York City public schools is north of $20,000. And the average day school, we're talking about day schools now, but day school tuition is approximately $22,000. That's from kindergarten through high school, just averaged.
Right.
So in most districts or most areas, most metropolitan areas where day schools are prevalent, their costs per student are pretty consistent with the cost to educate a public school student. And remember, of course, that yeshivas or day schools provide a dual curriculum. So in theory, they should have even higher costs.
Right. So for those out there who think, oh, yeshivas are just, they need more money than it costs to educate, it's really, that's about the cost that it is to educate, and you're just paying for the private school aspect of it.
Correct. Now, the question that a lot of parents are asking these days is, well, if I'm a full tuition payer, is part of that tuition going to subsidize another child? Meaning, is the actual cost to educate a child, if everyone were paying full, would it actually cost less money than that $22,000 on average? And the answer is to a certain degree, depending on the school. So approximately half of schools do charge a tuition that might include $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 of scholarship for a less fortunate family, but half of schools, in fact, don't. And we know that many smaller schools so I say smaller schools in small communities where there's generally been a population has left the community. Those schools are so fearful of losing any additional students that they generally subsidize tuition for everyone. That is, they're charging a full tuition that's less than the cost to educate a child.
Okay, so one of the things that it comes up all the time, but especially in the last year or so in COVID, is a lot of New York-based families are considering to move to other areas of the country. And obviously one of the big questions is going to be, what school would I send my kids to if I do that? Now, I shouldn't only say that it's just New York. I found that a lot of people in northern locations, though, Midwest locations where it's been during the winter, it's been cold and you can't really get together with people because of COVID. They want to move somewhere warm, to the Texas area, to the Florida area, to the California area. Where do the costs of schools compare in these warmer climate areas to the colder climate areas? Is there a place in the country where the cost of schooling is significantly more affordable, or is there a place in the country where it's significantly more expensive?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Thank you for that. In general, we see really close correlations between tuition levels and cost of living in different communities. And I don't think it's a function of weather. I think it's a function of just the economics, as I said, cost of living in those communities. So everyone assumes that New York is the most expensive market. New York's a very large market. At the top, some of the more prestigious, generally non-Orthodox schools in Manhattan, yes, are toward the very top, but Los Angeles and Miami have schools that are just as expensive as schools in Manhattan. Not all of them, but many of them. Not surprisingly, Los Angeles, Miami, Seattle are all high-cost markets. On the other side, there are lower-cost markets. Baltimore would be a great example. Baltimore is probably one of the lowest tuition markets for day schools anywhere in the country. Not surprisingly, the cost of living in Baltimore is also lower, below average relative to the rest of the country. Where it gets really interesting is where you see disconnects between the cost of living and the cost of day school tuition. Again, generally they align, but let's take a city like Philadelphia. I love picking on Philadelphia, having spent 2 years living there. Very easy city to pick on. But there are schools there that have very expensive tuitions that at least feel out of line with the technical cost of living. Now, some of that obviously has to do with the fact that there are wealthy pockets within certain suburbs of Philadelphia, but in general, that's an example of a market that sometimes feels misaligned in terms of cost of living and what the day schools charge.
And to be clear, what we're talking about with day school charging is the base price, not when it
Correct.
Okay.
No, not right. Correct. The gross tuition, the
Right.
stated or sticker or gross tuition.
Okay, so I'm going to throw out a couple of places just because a lot of people are questioning warmer climate areas. I'm going to throw out a couple of different locations and tell me if they more or less align with the cost of living expenses of those areas. Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, Las Vegas.
So Atlanta, I know probably the best of those four, and Las Vegas, frankly, I probably know the least well. But I'll say Atlanta, I think aligns pretty well. Again, one important caveat here is that there's still a wide range of tuitions within day schools in the city. So Atlanta has, I believe, seven day schools. There's a fairly wide range of of tuition. But let's say the average, I believe, in Atlanta is somewhere between $17,000 or $18,000, which is below average against the 22,000 average we talked about. And as far as I know, that will align pretty well with cost of living in Atlanta. So long as we're on the cost of living topic, there's one thing I really want to point out, which is there's cost of living to the world, and then there's the cost of Jewish living,
Right.
or living an engaged Jewish life. And beyond kashrut, the cost of keeping kosher and being an observant Jew is real estate costs. And so what of course will happen in a market like Atlanta or Las Vegas or Dallas or Houston is where Jews congregate and want to live in a Jewish community, the cost of real estate is higher. So it's when we talk about the cost of living index, let's keep in mind for most engaged Jews, it's going to be higher than whatever the national statistic is, because the real estate is going to be higher. But I would say Atlanta aligns pretty well. I would say that similarly, Dallas and Houston, to the best of my knowledge, align pretty well. Again, there are some outliers. There are some schools that are expensive schools within those communities that might look more what I often refer to as Jewish prep schools, that are going to be priced much more to attract a full pay, wealthier family. By the way, if you want a great example of that, Posnack in Miami, another warm climate, right, is among the most expensive tuitions nationally. It also has a wait list of students because its academics are perceived as so strong.
So we spoke about the average. What about extracurriculars? How do those types of things play into tuition costs? Most schools will charge extra if your child is on some sort of a team or in some sort of a club or some sort of a post-school operation. How does that affect nationally? Because it's an additional cost, unless there are schools out there that have it included.
Yeah, I would say it's the biggest impact of the quote unquote extracurriculars, what I sometimes call bells and whistles. I assume that's what you're referring to, is more on this is still more on the salary side. So when you look and you say, well, how is it? So if average tuition is $22,000, the average cost and the average tuition, and that's 80% salaries, how is it that we're spending about $18,000 per child on salaries? And the answer is because parents demand it to a large degree. Day schools are competing more and more with private schools, excellent private schools, charter schools, selective public schools, and they've needed and wanted, and parents have wanted them to invest in excellence. And excellence isn't just the best English or science or math or Judaic studies teacher. Excellence also means sports teams and food and trips and clubs, arts and music programs, STEM and STEAM labs. And again, there's the physical component of that, but the bigger component is actually the staffing of all those programs.
Right.
And that's why, again, we need to look to the staffing levels and say, yeah, we're spending about $18,000 a student on staff, partially because parents are demanding that level of excellence in the program, which means you need more staff to service it.
All right, so we spoke a little bit about the detriment of sending a kid with all the costs that involve it. But let's talk about the advantages of sending a child to a yeshiva day school. So the easy one is you get the Jewish education that you're not going to get sending to public school. For those parents out there thinking, maybe I'll save the extra $22,000 a year, which sounds amazing. If you have 4 kids, saving $88,000 a year. Or if you have more kids, if you have fewer kids, but everybody's thinking like, say, that price tag, and they're saying, all right, if I send to public school, here's what else I could do with that. But what do you get for actually sending, aside from the Jewish education, which we all who send to Jewish day school probably at this point perceive that that's really important. But what other advantages might you be thinking about that you get by sending your kid to a private yeshiva day school?
So I think first and foremost, at least for me, would be community and a sense of community. And it's not just me saying that, but if you look at over the past year, really an unprecedented number of former public school families who opted to send their children to a Jewish day school they're talking about that. The first thing they're mentioning, we're doing, by the way, with Rosoff Consultants, we're going to be doing a survey of these families that are new, former public school families that are new to Jewish day schools. But what we're hearing early on is that the first thing they're citing beyond the academic excellence is this incredible sense of community, which they never found in public school. Now, sort of anticipating your next question, there are private schools that do community well also. It doesn't have to be a Jewish day school, but I would say our day schools and yeshivas, their primary selling point beyond the Judaic studies curriculum is that they really cultivate a sense of community. They support each other, and especially in a time of crisis like COVID, that support is really, really critical. And families know it, and they feel it, and I think they appreciate it.
Well, you said the magic word, COVID, so we have to talk about that. So you mentioned new families. Have you seen an uptick in enrollments in yeshiva day schools due to COVID, due to maybe people living in areas where the public schools are not open in person? Have there been more people that come over because of that?
Yes, absolutely. This past year alone, meaning the 2021 school year, the year we're in, based on a survey that we did, which had a pretty good response rate, overall enrollment was up nearly 2%, and it was driven counterintuitively, it was driven by non-Orthodox enrollment. So the trends coming into the 2021 school year had been that Orthodox schools had been growing modestly, low single-digit rates of growth, and non-Orthodox schools had been declining pretty consistently year after year. And in 2021, that trend reversed because of this public school phenomenon.
Right.
For the most part, public school families chose community day schools and not Orthodox day schools. And Orthodox families, by and large, were the ones that moved around, so that if you were in an Orthodox school in Manhattan, you were more likely to leave and go to Miami or some other warm climate, or make Aliyah, partially catalyzed by COVID. But the biggest change this year has been, an unprecedented number of former public school families deciding to enroll their children in yeshiva or day school.
Now I'm going to throw out two more things that I'm not sure if these fall under your purview. Maybe somebody else in Prisma might be more akin to talking about this, but I would say parents have more of a say in the education in a yeshiva day school, but I should say in a private school when they're paying customers versus in the public school, and that there are no unions to deal with when you're talking about it, unless there is a Jewish day school out there that has unions.
There are actually a few. It's a minority, but a sizable minority.
Okay.
Philadelphia has one or two schools that are unionized. All the Toronto schools, many or all are unionized. Montreal, I believe, has some, but I would say a not insignificant minority of schools are unionized. But you're right, the majority are not. It's very interesting. When we go into schools and kind of do a deep dive or strategic planning with them, one of the issues we'll hear consistently, usually from the teachers, is that there's too much kowtowing to parents, and parents have too much say. And as you said correctly, it's not an issue particular to Jewish day schools. It's an issue that's relevant to all private schools. When you're paying money, you frankly have a lot more say. The very prestigious independent schools, the ones with long wait lists, are basically able to say to parents, like, they're able to push them back and say, if you want to come here, it's our way, and we've got a wait list. But obviously there are not as many private schools and or Jewish day schools that have the luxury of doing that.
Right.
So yes, parents often do get a disproportionate say. The other thing worth noting is that parents are often comprise 80 or 90% of a school board. And we see plenty of conflicts there also when the board members themselves are existing parents. It's very, very often very hard to be objective about the issues that board members are supposed to be objective about when it's really impacting their own children.
Everybody listening to this is going to say, okay, fine. I understand how schools operate. I understand how where my tuition dollars are going, and I understand kind of why there's those costs, but I still can't afford that. What are schools trying to do in order to reduce costs as much as they can? And if there are ideas that Prisma is developing or looking into that might help make yeshiva tuition more affordable in the future, especially because most people who, if you own your home, you're paying for the public school system in your neighborhood, and you're paying for your child to go to tuition to go to school. So people are kind of paying a double tuition in that case. So people who want lower tuition, what hope can we afford them?
So let's talk about kind of the root cause of the, what we call the affordability crisis. And there are obviously different views on this. My view is that the single largest cause has been the rate of tuition inflation over the last 10 to 20 years versus the rate of wage inflation. That is, most of us have seen very little wage inflation over the last decade or two. So that a person that was making $200,000 15 years ago is making $200,000 today. 15 years ago, when you were making $200,000 a year and you had 2 or 3 children, you probably didn't need scholarship. But with tuition increasing 3 to 4% a year each year, and the compounding effect of that against your flat salary, that now that $200,000 a year family requires some level of scholarship. And that's what we call the middle income affordability crisis. The problem is that it's very hard for schools to lower their costs. Why have they raised tuition 3 or 4% a year? Because generally they want to provide a 1, 2, or 3% a year salary increase to teachers, who are generally considered just modestly paid and depend on those increases. And then healthcare costs alone, we know, are escalating at double digits each year, which means that for a typical school, their costs just in healthcare alone are going to go up at least 1%, if not 1.5% each year. You combine a 2% salary increase with a 1.5% medical healthcare cost, you need 3.5% more tuition dollars each year. And the majority of your families aren't making 3.5% more in their own salaries each year. Right. And that's your affordability gap. So on the cost side, it's very tough to attack that in a meaningful way, since again, 80% of your costs are salaries, which by definition are going up, as are healthcare costs. So beyond some collaborations, some shared services, which have some impact, but a limited impact, schools are generally focusing on the revenue side more than the cost side. That is, they're looking for more opportunities to raise non-tuition revenue to relieve some of the tuition burden on families. How do they do that? Areas like endowment. So there's been an increased focus on endowment over the past 10 or 20 years. Prisma, one of Prisma's predecessor organizations was PEAGE, and PEAGE introduced the Generations Program, which has helped schools raise over $100 million in endowment funds. There's close to $1 billion now in collective endowment funds among the roughly 300 day schools across the US and Canada. And the other big area is a focus on alternative tuition models. Again, on the revenue side, I'm sorry, that's a tuition related phenomenon where schools are simply saying, we understand that more and more middle income families can't afford this, and we need to lower the price, create different ways to lower the price for them. But the bottom line is, on the cost side, it's very, very challenging, again, because parents' expectations haven't changed generally, other than in small 1 or 2 communities, which I'm happy to talk about, where there's been a groundswell of support for just a low-cost model. Low cost generally meaning more like in the $10,000, $12,000, $15,000 a year area. But in general, parents still expect a quality education, something comparable to the best private or public schools in the community, and it's very hard to lower the cost there. So the focus has been much more on non-tuition revenue, monetizing real estate where possible, getting more federation and foundation funding, but much more on the revenue side than the cost side.
So in those communities that have had this groundswell for a low-cost school option, how did they do it?
So the best example is probably Yeshiva Hatid in Bergen County, New Jersey. That's a school that opened 6 or 7 years ago. And what they did is they said, okay, we are going to do a bottoms-up budget. Bottoms up meaning we are going to design a school that will cost $10,000, and will be self-sustaining based on that $10,000 tuition once we get to a certain size. In their case, that size was approximately 400 students. So effectively what they did is they said 400 students times $10,000 is $4 million. We're going to design a school with a $4 million budget, and it may go up, that budget may go up 2 or 3% a year, but our families can afford, a 2 or 3% increase each year as long as we start at $10,000. And the overwhelming majority of families, they have over 400 families now in that school. It's an Orthodox school, and the school's done well. What's interesting is Bergen County has, I believe, 8, maybe even 8 or 9 schools, and the overwhelming majority of those schools are doing well. So the market has grown. There are more young families moving to Bergen County, and there are many options. Yeshiva Hatid probably has the lowest tuition at $10,000 or $11,000, but even the schools charging $18,000, $19,000, $20,000 in Bergen County are doing well also.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I'm going to throw out 3 ideas that exist in the ether, and I want to see if you can give me your opinion on them. First one is a charter school option. So, I mean, if you could explain what a charter school actually is, because everybody hears charter school and they have a different opinion as to what a charter school is. Can you explain what a charter school actually is, and if you think it could work in a yeshiva environment?
So with the caveat that generally we consider charter schools public schools. They are public schools. There's a strong public funding component of them, and they're subject to many of the public school rules, with the caveat that they can also raise other funds and they have more flexibility to do certain things educationally. But clearly they are not religious schools. They're prohibited from teaching religion. So for instance, a Jewish charter school could teach about Israeli history. They can teach Hebrew language, which they're known for, and in some cases quite excellent at, but they're not, they're far from a robust curriculum. There really is no Judaic studies curriculum per se.
Okay.
And so academically, it is very different than your typical day school or yeshiva. Are they viable options? I think what's interesting is that they were Jewish charter schools were all the rage 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, and there's actually less talk, or at least less talk that I hear about Jewish charter schools. Miami has 3 or 4 very successful ones, and those have grown nicely. Again, interestingly, the day schools in Miami several have had very significant growth as well. And it's probably worth stating that obviously a lot of that is driven just by Jewish population growth in these communities. And Frank, when I mentioned Bergen County earlier, what I was trying to say was that there's been Jewish population growth, and that will lift a lot of boats. It can lift public school boats, charter school boats metaphorically,
right,
and day school boats. But charter schools have not. If anything, I would say they have in the last few years. There's probably been a little bit less interest in them than there were. And I think part of it is that, number one, the charter school movement has had mixed success. It's roughly the a third rule that all organizations find. A third are very successful, a third are not at all successful, and then there are a third in the middle that are just okay. And I think the same has been true of the Jewish charter schools. Even Michael Steinhardt's network in New York, 1 or 2 of the schools have done well reputationally. A couple of the schools have had poor reputations, and a couple are right in the middle.
Without going into exact detail of how this would work, a charter school that began their academic day at 11:30 or 12 o'clock or 12:30, but in the morning they rent out their space to a private yeshiva where kids can go and learn in the morning from 8 a.m. till 11:30. Is that something that can be done?
Yeah, well, it is being done.
It is being done,
but the times are flipped. So generally speaking, what the charter schools are doing is they are first of all, they're probably required to start their day roughly around in the morning, whenever consistent with when the public schools start.
Okay.
But what they're doing is they're taking advantage of the fact that they may be done by 1 or 2 in the afternoon and leasing out their building for more yeshiva-like Judaic studies programs in the afternoon.
Okay.
Those are often families whose children are enrolled in the charter school and were willing to pay a few $1,000s for some supplemental programs or education or the like.
Okay.
By the way, it's not only formal education; it's also informal things. So there might be Israel clubs or Hebrew language clubs, right? Again, for families that are interested in enriching that Hebrew or Jewish component in the afternoon.
Okay, what about the combining of smaller schools into one larger or multiple larger schools? And this usually would probably only work in areas with multiple schools that do the same type of education model or have that same type of education model. Is that something that has happened or can happen? What do you think about that? And how much would that actually save?
So it's a great question. We had predicted at the outset of COVID back in March, April, almost a year ago, that there would be that COVID would serve as a real accelerant to school mergers. And I'd say for the most part, we have not seen that. There's more discussion around it. There are more foundations and federations assuming that mergers and collaborations are inevitable, but as best as I can tell, the rate of mergers hasn't accelerated meaningfully. It's work that Prisma does and that a number of my colleagues and I do, talking to communities, foundations, federations, and individual schools about mergers and the benefits and the potential pitfalls. I would say in general, I'd say a few things. Number one, the reason it hasn't happened yet is that not that many schools are actually in a precarious financial position. Part of that is that they got government money, at least one round. The overwhelming majority of schools got 2.5 months worth of payroll through the PPP loans, those government CARES Act loans. There's a second round of that for schools that are in trouble, right? So the irony is that absent that money, we probably would have seen more consolidation because the schools that were in the worst financial shape would have been forced to close or merge, but they've been thrown a lifeline largely through the government and other philanthropists and the JCRIF funders. That was that consortium of Jewish funders that provided about $90 million in loans and grants to a variety of Jewish organizations, including day schools. But the government was the far larger piece of that. The other thing that's interesting, and you asked a great question, it's not clear in most mergers, you actually don't save a lot of money. We generally tell two schools that are thinking of getting together to assume not more than 5 or 10% budgetary savings. That's not insignificant, but it's not a game changer, and it's certainly not going to lower tuition meaningfully. So, you need, what I generally say is for a school to merge, 1 + 1 really needs to equal 3, meaning you need to be offering a vision of something that's significantly more compelling to a prospective or existing family than each of the schools are right now. So just if each school has 100 students and great, we're going to be the same school but have 200 students, that's not so compelling to families. The other thing that's interesting about mergers is that in the first year or two, they generally lose enrollment. And that's just because of the nature of change. And there are a certain number of families that are going to react to change negatively, and they're going to pull their students. What we see in successful mergers is that after a 2 or 3 year period, the successfully merged schools are able to grow those enrollments. One last point I'll make, which is that there isn't necessarily cost savings. There isn't necessarily economies of scale until you start getting into much larger than a few hundred students. So we don't really see scale in day schools until maybe 500 or 600 or more students. And even then, as a lot of people have pointed out, some of your largest schools, yeshivas and day schools, are among the most expensive.
Right.
In spite of their size. Again, because the parents, whether you have 500 or 2,500 kids in the school, parents are going to demand excellence, and they're going to demand extracurricular and enrichment and support services, etc.
Right. One of my private dreams is to have a Jewish school with 4,000 students. I actually used to be a teacher. When I did my student teaching in Forest Hills High School, there were 4,000 students in the building. that is probably a conversation for a different time, but what that would look, that probably is extremely complicated on how to do that, and if it's even possible. But that's something that is kind of my dream, and now that you say that, that might not even help with the costs, maybe dashing my dream a little bit.
It does. It does help, but generally speaking, I guess the point I really wanted to make is that the schools that have merged, or that are thinking about merging, generally aren't likely to lower tuition as much as they are to invest some of the savings and some of the scale with greater students into more and more excellence.
Right.
Interesting, in Dallas, Kiva and Yavna were two a lower school and a high school in Dallas, Texas, that both modern Orthodox that got together and merged. And we spoke with the person that basically led that merger, and he's now of the view that he needs to be even larger to get the scale that they need. And I believe they're at 500 or 600 students. He needs to be twice that size. So it's a moving target, I guess is what I would say.
So the last idea that I want you to talk about, that maybe we spend a little bit less time on this one, is the cheder system, which is maybe a little bit similar to a charter school model, but maybe one where a yeshiva or a cheder would get a building close to a public school, and then after the public school dismisses, they send them across the street next door to the building where there is a yeshiva style education going on. Could that work? Has that been tried anywhere recently?
Right. So not exactly analogous, but in Boston, there was a program called Sulam. Again, not exactly analogous, where parents were being asked to send their younger children to public school to save the tuition, or parents were being encouraged to embrace this program, Sulam, which was essentially an intensive after-school program. And the idea was, in grades K through 5, you could send your kids to many of Boston's excellent public schools in the Brookline and Newton areas primarily. And then that would be supplemented by a really excellent afternoon program. It was actually held in a synagogue. And the person who conceived of this program, assumed that there would be a lot of day school families interested in this, because you could essentially save 6 years, K through 5, 6 years worth of tuition, then bring your child back into the day school when, in his view, it mattered most as they got older. What this person found was that the families that actually showed up the first year that Sulam existed were really public school families, people who were not interested in day schools, but wanted a more rigorous after-school program for their kids, and were willing to pay a few $1,000s, which was the cost of that program, for it. And I think that gets back to kind of where we started, which is, or talked about, this sense of community, that one of the things that day schools really do offer is this really intimate sense of community. And I think that's something that you don't quite get when you start mixing and matching. I'll take advantage of a free program in the morning, and then in the afternoon I'll do the Jewish component. I think you miss out on that community, not and of course the rigor of a day school or yeshiva.
Dan, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people learn more about Prizmah?
I would say just go to our website, www.prizmah.org. We have a wonderful knowledge center there. We archive all the institutes and webinars that we've done, and there are many. We do several webinars a week, and most of them are archived on our website. Our knowledge center also has lots of articles and studies and surveys that are done on issues related to day school finance and day school leadership. And it's a great resource. So start with our website, I would say. And obviously, my contact information is there as well for anyone who'd like to get in touch with me directly.
All right. And we will link, of course, in the show notes to Prisma's website and all of their social media accounts on the various platforms and what have you. Dan, thank you so much for joining us this week, and good luck to you in the future.
Thank you very much. Really a pleasure to spend time with you.
My thanks to Dan Perla from Prizmah for joining me this week. I definitely think that we only scratched the surface on this topic, and if you think you have other ideas or areas that need to be discussed, let us know on our social media or via email. We may do another episode on this topic in the future. Additionally, we actually spoke about the topic of tuition in the past. Well, sort of. If you would like to hear how schools could have and perhaps should have handled tuition during COVID, you can check out episode 37, Yeshiva Finances in the Age of COVID-19 with Alan Steinberg. If not, we'll see you next time. Kol Tov.
The Jewish Living Podcast is produced by Sreli Paikus. Our theme song is The Band by A.B. Rottenberg. Follow us on Facebook at The Jewish Living Podcast and on Twitter and Instagram at Jewish_living. You can also email the show at jewishlivingpodcast@gmail.com. The Jewish Living Podcast is recorded in conjunction with the Queen's Jewish Link.